Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please take your seats. The program is about to begin.
Come on, Nina, I can help.
At Fraser's Property, doing good means inspiring others to come together with a shared purpose. Together with our partners, we are creating experiences that shape a better tomorrow. Inspiring experiences, creating places for good.
Please welcome back to the stage Abby Danzig, Senior Programming Director for Bloomberg Green and Sustainability Events.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the afternoon portion of our program. Hope everyone had a nice lunch break, maybe listened to some conversations, met some new people, and had some good food. Just a couple of quick reminders before we get started. Please keep engaging with us on social media using the hashtag #SustainableBizSummit. And you can also use our QR code to ask our wonderful lineup of speakers questions and respond to polls. And because I just want to make sure that everyone is awake after lunchtime, we're actually going to do a poll right now. So get those phones out, get ready to scan the QR code. We are about to have a conversation on the future of sustainable work and jobs and the changing career landscape. So I want to get all of your opinion in this poll. What is the most important skill that workers need to build a sustainable future? Now, I think we can all agree that ideally it would be all three of these. But was the most important deep technical knowledge, strong communication skills, or an innovative mindset? I'll give you a minute to get your responses in, but what I think is so interesting about, sustainability and ESG as a field is that compared to some of the other functions of a company, it is still relatively new and nascent in comparison. And I'm sure that many of you are responsible for hiring within your organization. And as we see more and more people coming into professions within sustainability, there is certainly transferable skills from other jobs that could be used for these purposes of ESG and bettering the future. So let's pull up the results and see what you all think is the most important. Okay, an innovative mindset. By far and away our strongest winner, which I think is really interesting. So much of this is just being open to change, right? And also having creative ideas that are going to potentially be game-changing, or ideas that can just allow you to scale in a really smart and efficient way. What I think is so interesting about deep technical knowledge, sort of being our last one on here, is it really shows that the barriers to entry when it comes to jobs and sustainability maybe isn't as high as we thought. You don't need to have, an advanced degree in environment or something, that there is room for everyone within this field. Thank you all for answering our poll. And with that, I am going to welcome our next set of speakers to the stage for a conversation on jobs and the sustainable future. So please welcome Ayano Sanaha, Chief Operating Officer, Board Director, and Executive Vice President at Recruit Holdings, for a conversation with my colleague, Katrina Nicholas. Thank you.
Well, hopefully everyone has had a great lunch, and wonderful to see everyone back here this afternoon. Some of you might be forgiven for not having heard of Recruit Holdings, but I'm sure most of you must have heard of their very familiar brand names. They're the parent company of Glassdoor and also Indeed.com, which is the world's largest employment site. They're a Japanese company, very much global though, and headquartered in Tokyo. Recruit listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange in 2014, and today it has a market cap of about $100 billion US, which makes it one of the country's top 10 companies. And joining me today is Senna. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. The Chief Operating Officer of Recruit and also a member of the board of directors. She has been in charge of multiple divisions across the company and has also been leading the sustainability transformation of Recruit Holdings as well. Senna is also one of the youngest female directors among all Japan's listed companies and really has been pushing on this goal of sustainability and a commitment to clear targets and a timeline since May 2021. So just to kick things off, Senna, I've heard that Recruit is approaching sustainability in a very unique sort of way. Could you perhaps let me know, how have you been proceeding with this?
Thank you for having me. It is an honor to be here with you today. So Recruit, we have been pursuing sustainability in the center of our management. There are many companies who earns great profit, and there are many organizations who does great things for society, but there are very few who does both in scale. So we aspire to be one. So we want to grow by doing good. And that financial growth part can be measured in our financial performance. And so we thought that doing good part, the social impact part, that also should be measured. So we announced our sustainability commitments in year 2021 when new management took over. We have 5 quantitative targets with a 10-year time frame. So we're on a journey to hit these targets by 2030.
So what are some of the targets that you have set?
So as you kindly introduced, we help people get jobs. So I think what we consider to be particularly distinctive are around S-pillar targets. So for example, we set the target of shortening the duration of job search by half by 2030. And this originally came from the data that we saw in year 2020 from OECD, which said more than 40% of households could fall under poverty line if they don't have income for 3 months.
And that's an astounding number. We were talking about this backstage. I mean, 40%.
Right, in
really,
OECD countries.
And that's really arresting. Yeah. In OECD countries, yeah.
So that data showed us, and also year 2020 was, as we all experienced, was the COVID year, right? So it puts things into perspective, right? What we do as a business, we match people with jobs, and we say that we're number one in the market, but we saw so many people losing their jobs. And so we discussed very seriously about how can we contribute to society, and we decided that we want to shorten the duration of job search by half by 2030, and that could contribute to society because it will be better for their financial securities and stuff. So that's one target. The another one also in S-pillar is to help 30 million people facing barriers get hired. So some issues cannot simply be solved by improving our matching efficiency alone. So, like for example, there are people facing barriers in the job market. For example, like educational background being one of them, or maybe disabilities, or they don't even have an access to technology sometimes. So we want to be specific about these audience, and we need to go above and beyond for them to get hired. So we set a specific target for 30 million people facing barriers getting hired by 2030. The other S-pillar target we set is about ourselves. So we set the gender parity goals for ourselves in each, like all layers. So individual contributor level to manager level to the top executive layers too, that we want to be at parity by 2030. So those are the S pillar targets. We have one E pillar target and we have one G pillar target. So total 5 targets that we announced in year 2021. So those are the targets that we set.
I know this morning's session was a lot about the E, sort of part of the ESG equation, and you're very much focused on the S part of that. And some say it's quite difficult to come up with these specific numbers around the sustainability pillar. So why, I'm just curious, why did you sort of set that as a specific target within the sustainability realm?
I think it is true that like E pillar compared to E pillar, where like the name of the game is set and that's net zero, and everybody is going for that. And compared to that, it's a little tricky to set targets in S pillar, but that doesn't mean that you cannot do it. So I think there are 3 key ingredients that we cared about when we set that target. So the first one, it needs to be measurable. S pillar can be like fluffy, right? Like we aspire to like.
It can be,
right?
We do that a lot with with greenwashing with companies.
Yeah. But then you need to be able to measure something to make improvements. So it needs to be measurable. That's one. The second point is it needs to be directly linked to your business growth. The third point is it needs to come from within. So maybe I'll explain the second one, the direct link to the business. So maybe taking a look at our case, for example, shortening the duration of job search by half, right? That's good for society. But it could also mean, half the duration means double the speed. Double the speed could mean it's double the value. And that could also mean double the monetizing opportunity for us. So it makes sense commercially, long term, for us too. So that direct link to your business growth is critical when you really want to make it happen. So that's the point 2. And maybe if I can add some color to that third one, it needs to come from within part. Like when you set the target, you hope that everything goes as planned and smoothly. And we all know that that's not really the case in our real life. So I've received tons of questions from our institutional investors, from our employees, from medias, like, how are you guys actually doing? Are you actually going to hit it? Like, where are you, right? And we share our progress every year, very openly, some success, some failures. And so you face those tough questions every year. And you need to strive forward in those difficult times. And so you've got to want to do it to be able to go forward. So I think it's okay to start the conversation by having pressure externally, maybe from investors, maybe from your employee. But I think at the end of the day, you need to want to do it. So I think those 3 ingredients are very important for target setting.
And that 2030 time frame, I mean, 10 years is a long time, many people think, but I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually quite short. But I suppose it's still a time frame that is comprehensible to most people. Most people can think at least 10 years forward. Then again, as we've just said with COVID, I mean, many things can happen in that 10-year period that you're not, you just can't possibly foresee. So, but it just can, you maybe add a little bit of colour about the 10 years for you.
Sure. So maybe if I may speak a little personal stuff too, like it all started in 2020. Yeah. I knew I was going to be nominated for the board director next year, and I would have that power right? And I was asking myself, what do I want to do? And, as I said, we match people with jobs, and we have, 350 million unique users that come on our site every month. We hire 23 hires per minute every day, all 3 years. So it adds up to 12 million hires annually, and it's great to be number one in one arena. But if you look at the Earth from other planet, who is number one in HMRC market doesn't matter. I mean, it does to me, but it doesn't in the grand scheme of things, and it shouldn't. But how are we going to use this increasing power and influence does matter. So that's how we started that conversation. And when we set the targets, for example, maybe gender parity is the easiest one, how to make it happen in 10-year time frame where you see gender parity in all level, including the executive level. And again, to put things into context, Japan is not known for gender equality, right? I think we can all agree on that one. So there are lots of pushback internally, even before setting that target. And I still have those questions from my investors, Senna, how are you actually going to make it, right? And I always say, we have 10 years, and let's look back 10 years ago. So our target was set in 2021. So let's say 10 years before that, so 2011, let's say, if I had asked the executive team of our company 10 years ago, and if we look at the company where we were at the time, the revenue from outside of Japan was 1%, 2%. So it was ignorable, basically. We were very domestic, non-public company in Japan. And over the 10-year time frame, we grew massively, and the revenue from outside of Japan was already over 50% in the year 2020. So for me, if I had asked that question to the top management 10 years ago, I don't think they had any clear path to get to where we were in year 2020. And that gives me hope, right? Yeah. 10 years is long enough to make something impossible possible. Yeah. So when I'm asked by investors, how are you going to make it? Do you have a clear path? I always answer, I don't have one yet. Yeah. We'll figure it out. And we try new things. As a tech company, we have 500 A/B testing at any given time. So we try new things. Some succeed, some fail, and that's okay, right? Yeah. But I think 10 years is a time frame that you can do something that you cannot even imagine.
Exactly.
That can be done.
Let's dig a little deeper into gender parity goals. You mentioned Japan is not leading the world when it comes to that. How realistic is gender parity?
We need to make it realistic, right? I think we're fed up. We need to end this conversation on a panel talking about gender equality. We need to end this as a topic in our generation, I think. So we're making good progress on that. For us as a group, for individual contributor, we're already at parity. So that's good. For the top management layer, which we had anticipated the toughest to move the needle on, the women representation was from 10%, grew to 26%. So we're moving to the right direction. But again, we have parity as our goal. So we have a long way to go there. And for the boardroom, we also set the gender parity target for the boardroom. And we were 20% women representation, and now it's 33% this year. So again, that improved, but it's not parity yet, so we've got a long way to go.
What level of the companies do you think it's most difficult to achieve gender parity? You mentioned the senior management. You thought that perhaps would be challenging. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. But are there other layers of perhaps middle management or even more junior people coming into the workforce? Is that easier to achieve gender parity at that point, or are there different sort of obstacles that present itself?
I think it's universal that the higher the layer goes, the level goes, it's more difficult. So it's common to see the numbers go down when you get to the higher level internationally. So I think that's something that we have in common. And what can drive the better mix of gender can vary from country to country or operation to operation. For example, at Indeed, especially in the US, the biggest driver for gender equality is the hiring. So we need to make sure that we hire from diverse candidates. So we set the own rule of inclusive interview rule. The hiring managers cannot start interview process if they don't have diverse candidates. So those things worked. Compared to that, in Japan, hiring was already at 50-50, roughly speaking, but the promotion was very different from between male to female managers. And that's got something to do with the social responsibility or social aspect of what are expected of women to do at home kind of thing. So I think it's common to see higher side have less representation, but what drives better mix of gender, I think that is different, operation by operation, so you need to tackle with that, like where the problem is coming from.
Yeah, yeah. I think we are almost just about out of time, so thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. We do have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to throw it open to the audience. Any questions at all? We can, I think these are...
I'm happy to represent here. So we do actually have sort of a comment on the poll that happened before your session started that I think really relates to some of the stuff that you're saying, Senna. The person said the question should have an option for empathy. Spinning off of that, I'm curious as to how in the new world of labor, you're looking at soft skills for things such as empathy.
Yeah, I do agree. I was actually looking at the poll, and I found that very interesting. And like naturally, to have the innovative mind as the top of the three, I think we don't compete with technology, right? Technology will help us do better, be better. But soft skills are something that at the moment only us human has, right? So in that way too, like that's something that we can do better and more. So yeah, I do agree.
Yeah, empathy is definitely important. Any other questions? No, I'm not seeing any out there. So look, thank you all very much, and thank you especially to Senna. Thank you for joining us here today. Thank you.
The relationship between tourism and nature has always been a very important relationship. But unfortunately, it has been always a negative relationship where one is thriving over the other. What Red Sea Global is trying to do is have a very different approach. We believe that tourism does stand a very good chance as an industry to be the role model, to demonstrate to the world how things can be done differently.
Please welcome to the stage Mariam Ali Ficocello, Group Chief Governance Officer at Red Sea Global, Lucita Jasmine, Group Sustainability Director at RGE, and Wan Shizheng, Group Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Frasers Property Limited, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Lauren Keel.
our next topic here is a perfect continuation of the conversation that we were just hearing. And it's also reminding me of the very beginning of the day today when we talked about how are we thinking about the language in this space, and sustainability being the big term that people are using, and how we rethink, environmental, social governance. What we're talking about in our conversation today is around people and planet. And I think that's a really interesting way of kind of reframing what are we working towards here and what are we focused on. And as we think about how businesses can make an impact in this space, how do we keep coming back to those unifying terms of the people that we're working for and the people who are part of our organizations and the planet that we are all part of. So I'm really thrilled to be with 3 of our summit advisors here today to help us talk through this conversation. Lucita, I would love to start with you. At RGE, how are you thinking about how you benefit and protect people and planet? How is that built into your business model?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Lauren. Congratulations on an all-woman panel to begin with. Yes, so I represent RGE. RGE is basically a group of global businesses that operate in resource-based industries such as forestry, agriculture, and energy. Our businesses are some of the largest producers of pulp, paper, viscose for textiles, paperboard for packaging, tissues and hygiene products, and palm oil, among others. Being resource-based businesses, we basically recognize our intrinsic dependency on nature. And therefore, we have a long-term vested interest in making sure that we are able to protect and enhance the overall health and sustainability of the natural ecosystems on which we depend. Many of our businesses actually operate in developing economies, including countries like Indonesia and Brazil, where we recognize that many of our environmental challenges are actually rooted in socioeconomic drivers. We operate with the reality that in Indonesia, for example, some 26 million people still live below the poverty line, while in Brazil, that number would be about 70 million. So given these 2 fundamental factors of our businesses, where we are resource-based and therefore nature-dependent, and at the same time also operating in developing economies, embracing a holistic approach to people and planet is fundamentally an imperative for us. Right. So how are we embedding this in our business model? I think it all begins, it's actually rooted, in fact, in our founding principle, which our founding chairman, Mr. Sukanto Tanoto, actually calls the 5 C's. And this basically says we must first do good for the community, country, climate, customer, and only then can we do good for the company. So here you can see how we're measuring business success from the lenses of people and planet in terms of our impact on our communities and our customers and our country and climate as well. From our principle, of course, we've translated this as well, or we've adopted this holistic approach to people and planet in our purpose, which is about improving lives by developing resources sustainably. Again, reflecting this integrated approach. And then, of course, from these foundations of principle and purpose, we have adopted policies that will guide the actions of the different business groups within RGE. An example of this policy is in 2015, we adopted a sustainable forest management policy for our business group called April, which operates in Indonesia. And this commits us to, number 1, no deforestation since 2015. Number 2, really reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. 3, empowering communities. And 4, investing more in conservation. And we have adopted a unique commitment called 1 for 1, which is we conserve a hectare for every hectare of plantations that we've established. Moving forward, apart from policies, of course, we've also put in place forward-looking, ambitious 2030 sustainability agenda. Most of the businesses within the RGE group have adopted a 2030 sustainability agenda in 2020. And among the businesses, some of the common commitments that we have established are 1, again, zero tolerance for deforestation. 2, drastic reductions in our climate, in our emissions, and basically moving towards net zero by 2050, eliminating extreme poverty in the communities where we operate, and at the same time, of course, bridging the gender gap. So as you can see, we've very much systematically approached this embedding process in what we call the 4 Ps, from the level of principle to policies, and then purpose, and then policies, and then eventually programs.
Wenxi, the people and planet are also incredibly essential to the real estate sector, where Fraser's Property does your work. We also know that built environment is a huge source of emissions. It's up to 40% is the estimate there of global emissions. So how are you thinking about the role that you all can play in both decarbonizing the real estate sector and also thinking about making it more equitable and making it more inclusive for the people who occupy and work and live in those buildings?
So firstly, thank you for having me here today. I think real estate is something that's very close to to everyone here. We live, work, and play in buildings. And you're right, the built environment contributes to almost 40% of carbon emissions. So I think if you look at that from that perspective, at Fraser's, we think about how can we make sure that we're not, while we're part of the problem, we also want to be part of the solution. And the thing is, if you look at real estate as an industry, it's also really capital intensive. So in that sense, one single company can't change the world, but we believe that what we can do can generate a ripple effect in terms of the influence of people and planet, people around us. And what I mean by that is if you look at our real estate business, we're across 5 asset classes, and we operate in many parts of the world across Asia Pacific and in Europe and in the UK. So it's really about how do we leverage our real estate as a platform to engage the ecosystem. So I think firstly, it's important for us to be committed, and that's where we set ourselves out to be a purpose-driven company, which is why if you look at our purpose, it's about inspiring experiences, creating places for good. And for good, that's an important part of what do we mean by for people and planet. And of course, like many companies, we've committed to the net zero targets by 2050. We're the first real estate company to do so, first SGX-listed real estate company to do so. And 2050 is far away. So we've also made sure that we've set time-bound, near-term, 2-year targets across decarbonization, building certification, how are we looking at climate value at risk. But bring it closer to how we're looking at it from perspective of, I think, the E and the S of sustainability. I mean, to give an example, in the case of decarbonization, in Singapore, we've worked with the government and with SP Power to look at how to assess decentralized district cooling, where we use our buildings as an injection node as part of the network of cooling solutions. So that's one. And likewise, in Bangkok, in one Bangkok, our project which my group CEO spoke about yesterday, we're also having the first Thailand district cooling as well as power distribution systems. And with that, we're looking at removing over close to 10,000 of carbon per year. And that's equivalent to over 2,400 cars that's being taken off the streets. So that's how we're looking at the E front and just making, I mean, we've made good progress on scope 1 and 2, bringing that down by 30% over the last few years. And the question is, how can we do more in partnering on the scope 3 front? And so for real estate, you can't talk about the business without talking about people. And this is where I think it's really close to our heart. We're the largest owner and operator of suburban malls in Singapore. And recently we rolled out an Inclusion Champions program where we actually partner our tenants to train them in awareness of neurodiversity and how can we make our malls like friendlier for the elderly and people with, who are sensitive on the sensory side. So we've made our malls like quieter, calmer, we've dimmed the lights. We call it Quiet Tuesdays, just so that we can contribute something back to the community. So I think really at the end of the day, it's really about, while we can't change the world, we can set examples of what we're doing and working with our stakeholders, whether it's our tenants, our suppliers, to bring all of that together.
And Miriam, on that exact note of how you're setting an example, you at Red Sea Global have an amazing opportunity where you're getting to build conservation from scratch, from the beginning of these destinations. So tell us, how are you thinking about people and planet as you're constructing these new destinations?
Thank you. So yes, so at Red Sea Global, for those of you that are not familiar with our company, we're a real estate developer as well. But we've been lucky that it's greenfield development, which means that we have the opportunity to build it right from the very beginning. And since we started, we knew that sustainability is no longer enough. We have to do a little bit more than that. And so we've been focusing on not only responsible development, but also regenerative tourism. So from the very start, we spent about 2 years doing a marine social planning exercise where we studied what the environment and the natural habitat is. And then based on that studies, which we also published in scientific journals and made publicly available, we committed we made a commitment that we will have 30% net positive contribution to the environment by 2040. Which, of course, affected everything we do. So even though we're in an archipelago of about 90 islands, we're only developing 22 of those islands, which is 1%. We also put aside 9 islands that are just for conservation. And we're hoping to reach that net conservation benefit by giving back to the environment, so whether it's to the wetlands, to the coral reefs, the seagrass, we'll be adding and creating a positive impact by growing those different marine ecosystems so that we can ensure that we leave the environment and enhance it much more than the way we found it when we first started.
Fantastic. I would love to talk a little bit more about the geographic component of all of this. And Wenxi, I'm going to go to you first. Fraser's property is in more than 20 different geographies. How do you balance the challenges of working across so many different geographies? As one centralized company, but yet you're dealing with, you know, the challenges of a lot of different people in a lot of places. How do you do that?
Firstly, it's about finding a common language. So, you know, we might have it's one thing to have a strategy, it's another thing to have implementation. So what we focus a lot about is how do we translate that strategy into implementation? And something that, you know, we have developed and are continuing to refine is a climate and nature transition plan. Because at the end of the day, when we look at sustainability, it's not the remit of just a sustainability team. It's a whole of company effort. So we look at how that translates into what we need to look at on incentives and remuneration, how we look at investments, how do we look at technology, development, building, so in a very integrated way. So that's one on a common language. And I would say the other aspect of it is really about cross-pollination, because we are in both developed and emerging markets, and the standards are different across. So what we really focus on is having cross-pollination and looking at where can we cross-pollinate solutions that are scalable and that can be replicated. So just give a few examples. In Australia, we've benefited a lot from the experience of the team on the ground looking at renewable energies. And likewise, in Singapore, we've basically done the largest scale of solarization of the retail malls across Singapore. On the social front, you know, in Singapore, we've got this community centers, and we've got a shopping mall in the northern part of Singapore called North Point City. It's got the first community mall in a shopping mall. And in Bangkok, Samyan Midtown, that's right by Chulalongkorn University, we've created a co-working space that's accessible to students and to the public, which they can use for free as part of the mall in terms of bringing the community together. So there's a lot of this cross-pollination that we do. And of course, importantly, is also how we work with the supply chain. So I've mentioned Project One Bangkok earlier. With about 75% of construction waste is actually recycled into concrete panels that we use in the development. And likewise, actually in the UK, when we demolish buildings, we look at recycling that into the piling mats, as well as the construction materials that we use on site. So there's a lot of cross-pollination, and I think that's how we minimize duplication of their learning curve, and we accelerate their learning curve by working with partners and having that synergy internally.
Lucida, a lot of the work that RGE is doing is in emerging markets, which brings a whole different set of challenges. So talk to us about some of the challenges that you see working within those markets. What are some good solutions you've developed in the regions you're working in?
Sure. Thanks, Lauren. I guess the fundamental challenge for us is really how do we continue growing the business while keeping to our sustainability commitments, right? And also delivering on some of the development goals that are needed in the countries where we operate. So in the last 5 years alone, our production volume has actually grown by 60% in one of the business groups that we have in RGE. And this is in April. And so the challenge was how do we keep supplying the increased fiber requirements of this business group of April without necessarily compromising our commitment to zero deforestation. So we needed to decouple growth from deforestation and keeping, of course, to our zero deforestation commitment. One of the solutions that we've come up with is, of course, investing significantly in R&D to continue increasing the productivity of our existing plantations. So any increased fiber to supply to our mills will not cause us to actually increase our footprint or expand our land bank. So, of course, we're doing this. So one of our targets is basically to improve the productivity of our plantations by 50% by 2030. And a lot of investments are actually going into making this happen. We're on track, and we are actually recording at least a 12% increase in the last 3 years. Now, another innovative solution that we've introduced to the industry is it basically responds to the challenge of how do you keep conservation viable? How do you keep financing conservation? Because conservation of natural forests in Indonesia, where socioeconomic pressures continue to be experienced by the forests, is quite an expensive proposition. So how do we maintain that without actually protect that in terms of market downturns? So a key initiative that we've adopted, which we believe is unique in our industry, is that we adopted a conservation levy. So basically, we believe that if you're producing from the land, you need to be able to give back to the land. So for every ton of fiber that goes into our fiber supply, we're allocating $1 for conservation. And on a yearly basis, that could be up to $17 million that are spent on conservation initiatives within our operations and also outside our operational boundaries through partnerships with conservation NGOs, communities, and government as well. In the last 5 years, we've amassed a total of $60 million for conservation, is spent on conservation initiatives. And I think another innovation that we've done, which is quite significant because it has even created another business vertical for the group, right? This is what we call our Waste to Value initiative, where we signed up a partnership a couple of years ago with a company called CEPSA in Spain. And this is for the establishment of one of the bigger production facilities for sustainable aviation fuel in Southern Europe. So it will be producing more than 1 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel using agricultural waste, residues, and even used cooking oil. So these are second-generation feedstock that are actually being used to create another business while at the same time helping to decarbonize the aviation industry. And finally, I think another innovation, what we would consider to be an innovative solution for us, is that we made a decision as a business group that all our financing will be linked to sustainability through the raising of sustainability-linked loans. So 100% of our deals are now linked to sustainability KPIs. And what this does is basically it opens up the business to scrutiny by the banks. And we all know that the banking community is quite good at scrutiny. So that's one. And then basically, of course, it's ensuring that it's mainstreamed into the business. So sustainability now has impact on the companies, on the business group's finances. Meaning, depending on how we perform on the KPIs, we can either increase or lower our interest rates. So these are some of the innovative approaches that we have introduced in making sure that sustainability is again embedded in the business model.
Miriam, you're also thinking very much about what Lucida said about making conservation viable. So I would love to hear from the Red Sea Global perspective, what are some of the innovations that you're putting in place for the communities you're within, and how are you thinking about the challenges of the supply chain that you need to bring into those communities?
So yeah, I mean, we also have been trying to, because we're greenfield and we have the opportunity to do things differently. From the very beginning, we committed to things like powering our destination completely through renewables. So we've been putting out, trying to ensure that we have the right capture of sunlight so that we power our destinations with it. So we've built 760,000 photovoltaic panels and battery storages as well to capture that. We've also been, as I mentioned earlier, avoiding or limiting. We plan to limit the number of our guests to our destinations to only 1 million guests per year for our Red Sea destination and 500,000 guests only for our Amala destination. We also, I mentioned our conservation net benefit commitment. We've built the number, I'm trying to remember the number now, 38 hectares of wetlands to try and attract biodiversity and regenerate that as well. We've also committed to building the largest nursery, landscaping nursery in the region, and we're right now at, it's supposed to grow up to 50 million plants, but right now we're at 6 million plants. And we're hoping all of this, and this is all in consultation, obviously, with our supply chain, with our the local community as well, to find out what do they need in terms of structures and what does the supply chain need as well. Because we found out, because we're in a remote area and we're doing things so differently, there aren't so many in the supply chain that are ready for us. And so we've been investing in our suppliers and our partners as well to ensure that they're able to provide for us sustainably, and they're able to also carry on doing business in Saudi in ways that are better for the environment and for the built environment.
I think when we talk about ESG, we get a lot of emphasis on the E and less on the S, right? And that tends to be, it makes sense. It's harder for us to track. There's not as many quantifiable metrics. We get a lot of global attention on climate change. But I want to make sure that we come back to the S here, because I think it's so critical as we think about people and planet. Lucida, how are you making sure in your work that the S is getting equal focus rather than just the E?
In RGE, I think a fundamental principle that we abide by is that environmental or social are two sides of the same coin. We cannot address climate in isolation. There are interdependencies across the pillars of climate, nature, people, and achieving growth for the business. There are synergies that can be managed as well. I think we also understand quite in the 5 decades that we've been operating in developing economies that the environmental challenges are very much driven by socioeconomic pressures. When we were faced with challenges like illegal logging, for example, in Indonesia, this is basically driven by the need for jobs. Encroachment or illegal conversion of forests into oil palm plantations by the communities are basically about having access to livelihood. And burning, which is a very familiar issue here in Singapore, is basically driven by the need to clear land in the cheapest way possible by the communities. So if we do not address the root causes, we won't be able to address the environmental issues. So we have come up with several initiatives, particularly with the local communities, to ensure that we are able to give them the opportunities for socioeconomic development or empowerment, even as we grow the business and even while we address some of our decarbonization initiatives. We also need to make sure, of course, that even as we pursue our increased conservation ambition across our GE between Indonesia and Brazil, we manage a total of 500,000 hectares of forests conservation programs. But we need to make sure that we also bring the communities and the suppliers along with this, right? So one example of this, for example, is that if the communities need to clear land, we have a program called the Fire-Free Village Program, which we've initiated 5 years ago, wherein if the community sign up to an MOU with us, we are able to provide them means for mechanical means to clear the land, while at the same time giving them a reward of up to $10,000 that they can use for social infrastructure. So if the communities do not burn during the dry season in Indonesia, for example, which is right now between July and September, then they are able to get either a new mosque, a bridge, a daycare center, or whatever it is that they agree on as a form of reward for their use. Now, in the last 5 years that we've had this, we've actually engaged with a total of 900,000 hectares of area that's managed by the villages themselves, and we have reduced the incidence of burning by up to 90%. So I think that's a very specific example of how we're able to work with the communities and at the same time bringing them along. In the agribusiness, we have a program called SMILE, which is sustainable inclusivity for better Smallholder Inclusivity for Better Livelihood and Empowerment. It's a partnership between our two agribusinesses, Apical and Asian Agri, and a company in Japan called COW, where basically we aim to engage 30,000 smallholders so that we can build their agricultural practices, provide them with high-yielding varieties, and get them ready or capacity ready for certification. And to date, we have actually worked with about 3,000 smallholders. 400 of them have now been certified to RSPO standards. And we're seeing an average income uplift of about 30% because of the increase in yield and, of course, in terms of the premium that comes with certification. So at the end of the day, it's really about, again, going back to the purpose of being able to improve lives through our initiatives and integrating and coming up with an integrated approach across the E and the S in our business model. Thank you.
Wenxi, the buildings that you are developing and managing now are going to exist for the future, right? You're preparing not just for today, but for generations to come. So how do you think about, how do you innovate for society in the future? How do you invest in what's going to make an impact, not just today, but for the generations to come?
Yeah, I think the intuitive thing for real estate is all about people, and also because real estate, like you mentioned, is built for the long term. So I think for a start, when we look at our investments, it's going to make sense, obviously, from the IRR point of view, but for that product to really work, it needs to also speak to the community. And one thing that we're very conscious of is we don't operate in a vacuum, right? So if the societies, the communities we operate in, if they're resilient and if they do well, we'll do well as a business. So if I give an example, it's a project called Midtown that we've done in Sydney. It's a mixed-use development with providing homes for over 6,500 people. And this project has a mix of commercial housing and social housing, but we call it community housing in Australia. And in that product, when we design it, we're very conscious that it's really about how do we deliver a happy and thriving and resilient community. So and I was actually there at a project in Sydney just a few weeks ago. When we were there, you actually don't see the segregation between the social and the commercial housing, and we've very consciously developed the community such that we've got programs designed where we bring the communities together. And like one of the residents there, she was just saying, if not for this project, she could have been homeless. And when she's there in a community, she doesn't feel like she's being differentiated from everyone else, which I think is a really good both commercial and social outcome. And of course, because we built something that we built is going to last for generations, so we're also very conscious about the environmental impact of that, right? So it's a 6-star green rating, but the Australian local green rating. And big focus on biodiversity. So we actually have 6 bee farms on site. We use that to run residence program, and we bring people from different socioeconomic status together. And of course, bees are great for biodiversity. So I think when we look at how can we be responsible in what we're delivering, the E and the S can actually come naturally together. And we find it also makes good business sense because governments are seeking us out to be partners in delivering these projects. So I think at the end of the day, it's really about thinking about sustainability in a very holistic way. And really, if the community does well, we'll do well as a business. So that's our ethos as a business.
And Mariam, you all are also thinking about building something now for generations to come. So how are you thinking about that social piece with your work? How are you thinking about the communities that you exist in and the people who are going to come to them?
Yeah, so the areas we're developing in do have a lot of small villages. They're not big cities. And one of the things that we took into consideration was that inflation will come with the development we put in place, and that will negatively affect the local communities. So we started engaging with them to make sure that, first of all, we're respectful of how we can help them grow what is important to them, whether it's the farming industry that they already had in place, arts and crafts, sailing was a big thing as well in the local community. And then we also made sure that we have programs to upskill the local communities so that they can find jobs with us in the future. So we started vocational training programs 2 years ago. and 430 students graduated already from that program, and they're already all working either directly with us or with our partners. We also started a graduate program for bachelor's degrees in hospitality management. 4 or 5 years ago, the first batch has graduated as well, of 107 students. 40% of all of these students are from the schools. But we also looked at things like boat captains, tourists or just local guides that used to take people out for tourism, and started upskilling them as well. And that's been very successful as well in helping prepare them for the future and for the tourists that will come.
Please join me in thanking our summit advisors from RGE, Red Sea Global, and Fraser's Property. Thank you all.
When should we get things right? When they are already done, or when they are being made? Because in the end, the start is what matters the most. We need to get things right from the start. RGE.
Please welcome to the stage Mihir Parshad, founder and CEO of Umami Bioworks.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Mihir, and today I want to tell you a little bit about how we can rethink the way that we do production for seafood and other products to help us cultivate a more sustainable future, not just for seafood, but for the way that we manufacture organic goods. And so I want to start with something that I'm sure everyone here has seen a version of, which is basically the carbon intensity of the foods that we eat. And on this chart, I think you can see probably what you expect to see, which is that beef tends to have the greatest carbon intensity, particularly when we account for the methane emissions that also come from cows' digestion, and that red meat, including lamb and goat, is also very high on this list. And the only seafood really represented in these discussions are farmed prawns and farmed fish. We farm over a dozen species of fish, but you'll see they're all sort of grouped here under one label. And that actually hides quite a lot of information. What it tells us, maybe at a high level, is that seafood is quite a sustainable source of food, and that it has quite low emissions, quite similar to pork and chicken, a little bit higher when you account for the methane. But there's no wild-caught fish on this list. So does that mean that all of our wild-caught fish are all the way down to the bottom, even lower carbon emissions than things like nuts and apples? Unfortunately, no. And actually, some of these wild-caught species are in fact substantially higher. We just don't break fish out by species to actually know that this is the case. And if you look at fish that are caught by bottom trawling, things like flounders, lobster, shrimp and prawns, or caught by similar methods that cause disruption of the ocean bottom, they actually have emissions that would put them near the top of the list I just showed you. And this is just accounting for the direct emissions that we can calculate today. But there's actually new information that's been published in the last 3 years. And it's still early, so we don't know how robust this data is. But if it turns out to be accurate, it will be the case that trawling emissions are actually the methane of the seafood industry, and they completely change the way we need to think about sustainability in our food system. So the way this works is trawling dredges the ocean bottom. So you drag a net along the bottom of the ocean and disrupt all of the sediment that is settled there. Part of what's in that sediment is quite a lot of carbon from organic matter that's degraded in the ocean as animals died and settled to the bottom, and it's been taken out of the fast carbon cycle. So it's been out of the environment, out of the atmosphere, I should say, for a century or more in many cases. And we're now putting half as much just from that bottom trawling back into the atmosphere as global aviation every year, purely from bottom trawling. And on a per kilogram basis, that's 26 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of fish that you eat from a flounder or a cod or a haddock that are going back into the environment, making that seafood that is trawled among the highest emissions food that you could be eating. And right now, we subsidize this to the tune of $37 billion a year in the form of subsidies largely to defray the cost of fuel for deep-sea fishing vessels, to make it affordable to catch many of these fish. And bottom trawlers are among those that require subsidies to function because dragging a net along the bottom, as you might imagine, not very fuel efficient. And the reality is that half of all fisheries from the deep oceans would be unsustainable without these subsidies. So we're actually breaking a natural market function and encouraging overfishing and increasing carbon emissions in our seafood system. What we would like to propose to you today, and what we do at Umami, is to basically cultivate seafood from cells to create more sustainable solutions, particularly for these high emissions species that are also typically at risk of being endangered or threatened. And the way that works is you start by taking a small sample of cells from these fish and figuring out what they like to grow, what they need to be fed. And we use machine learning to help accelerate this process and then put those cells into a bioreactor, which is functionally a large beer brewing tank with some sensors and feed lines. We then grow the stem cells from a single fish up to hundreds of thousands of tons of potential from that single cell line, turn it into muscle and fat. And that muscle and fat can then be incorporated either directly as only cells or into product forms that include other plant ingredients to create finished products. And we think the key unlock here is to enable incumbents to rapidly adopt different approaches to the ones they're doing now. And so the approach that we're taking is building basically the AWS for biomanufacturing. So think of it like a platform as a service. You get a full supply chain that is spec'd in with strategic supply agreements, so the pricing and the volumes are known. The factory itself is basically built in a modular and plug-and-play way, so that a traditional company that runs fishing vessels and maybe some fish farms can adopt a very high-tech system. And because it's a standardized system, we can actually deliver machine learning-based automation on top of that to make it accessible to a traditional food incumbent. And finally, on the commercial side, we can provide full traceability and impact reporting that can go direct to the customer or all the way through visibly to the end consumer. So we can actually address multiple layers of challenges in the food system where seafood typically has problems with species labeling and with obscurity to the consumer, where their fish came from and whether it's a sustainable choice or not. And this is all built on a foundation of core technologies that can be applied from species to species and are broadly applicable to anything that can be grown from an animal or a plant cell. And we've already started building a foundation with some of the world leaders in seafood to transform the seafood industry from the inside. I fundamentally think in industries that people rely on to live, disruption is not a viable strategy, because when you break systems, people's food and people's lives are at risk. So we can't afford to break the seafood system. We need to reform it as quickly as we can and bring the incumbents along with us. And our strategy for doing that is working across multiple categories and geographies. Right now, in the US and in Singapore here, we're working on cat and dog treats that will be launching, we hope, within the next 6 months. It will actually bring these premium products to consumers for animal, which currently consumes 10% of all the fish we catch globally, enough to feed another 1 billion people. And with Maruha Nichido, the world's biggest fishing company, based in Japan, on premium products for Japan, which is one of the world's leaders in premium seafood, including things like eel. But I think one question that is often a difficult one in thinking about this sort of model is how do you get an incumbent who makes money the traditional way, trawling and catching and farming fish, to decide to embrace technology that at first might seem competitive? And the solution for that, in our view, is to prioritize areas where our incentives align with the incumbent's incentives and with the consumer. And there's a couple of criteria where we think form that nexus. The first is species that are already unsuitable for commercial farming, where the only option is to catch them in the wild. The second is species that are already listed as endangered, threatened, or protected, often on the IUCN Red List as an example, because those species do not have unlimited catch potential. They often have limits imposed or catch bans season by season, depending on the level of the safety of that fishery. And fish that are unprofitable without subsidies, because subsidies exist because we need to provide food for people at affordable prices. But given the alternative, companies don't want to put their entire bet on the fact that the government is going to continue to finance them to catch things. That then narrows us down to a handful of species, and the last layer we apply is greenhouse emissions. And we look at which species would have the most impact on reducing emissions if we could move away from the way they're made now to an alternative. And that leaves us with 3 that we've decided to start with: the Japanese eel, the flatfish in the form of a sole or a flounder or halibut, and prawns. And these are the species we're currently working on with our partners. And that's a $70 billion opportunity just across these handful of species to bring these products to market. So it's big enough for incumbents to get excited. These are problematic enough for incumbents to come to us and actually listen to us when we say that there's a reason to look at an alternative. And the last message that I want to leave you with is, I think food is not often considered at the discussion for where should we put our money for climate. And I think that's a huge mistake. And this is a report that was put out by BCG just a few months back, that in terms of both impact on capital deployed, in terms of gigatons of carbon emissions avoided or reduced, complementary proteins, including plant and cell cultivated, are the highest return on emissions reduction per dollar by 3x. And the next best is concrete. So I think it's time that we start spending more effort on our food system and figuring out how we can reduce the emissions, because we can't get to net zero, let alone 2 degrees, without it. If you're interested in this future, please come and join us in Cultivating Without Compromise. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Ujjwal Deep Dahal, CEO of Druk Holding and Investments, Leong Wai Ling, Managing Director and Regional Head of Asia Pacific for CDPQ Global and CDPQ Singapore, Oliver Tan, President and CEO of Citicorp Renewable Energy Corporation, and Jaime Urquio, Chief Sustainability and Risk Officer at Ayala Corporation, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Ishika Mukherjee.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to talk about ESG in emerging markets. Emerging markets often have the short end of the stick when it comes to climate change, given that they are riddled by both economic and climate vulnerabilities. But as we've seen in recent years, it's not all bad news. China is approaching its peak carbon target, potentially ahead of its 2030 target. The Philippines is emerging as a pace setter for renewable energy in Southeast Asia. And you're seeing countries come out with climate disclosures, which should give investors more transparency. So here to discuss the ins and outs of climate finance in emerging markets, we have a star-studded cast today. I'll begin with Wai Ling. Can you talk us through CDPQ's strategy in the emerging markets and how much money you have deployed there? What are kind of the key hurdles today that you face when putting money into emerging markets?
Okay. Just a step back. So, APAC is now 12% of our deployment globally. So that's 12%. But having said that, our 12% is still largely in China, India, Australia, and Japan. All right? So the rest of Asia, so if you're referring to Southeast Asia, is still small for us. So that's one. And two, you were talking about the hurdles, and I think we prefer to look at it that there are opportunities in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia, in both emerging markets as well as developed markets. And we continue to believe that we can deploy constructive capital with sufficient returns that meets our needs. Yeah.
What are some of the low carbon and transition investments that you're looking at in Asia or in broader emerging markets right now?
Okay. So the way we look at it, we actually look at, we don't have a separate portfolio per se in terms of ESG or carbon. We don't have a separate portfolio. We actually look at every single one of our investment on its own and then we apply the necessary ESG filter to it. That's how it works. So including the E of the ESG. So we have taken into consideration the ISSBs, the TCFDs, and we developed our own filter to it. So only when it meets our own filter and the risk return stacks up, we will decide to invest. Yeah, so that applies whether you are in emerging markets, whether you are developed markets, whether you're in Asia or whether you're in the US. So it's the same standard that we actually apply.
And would you invest in renewable energy projects here, data centers, I don't know, energy efficient data centers, as we call them?
We do. So we happen to be one of the world's largest investor in renewables. As well as infrastructure. So just to give a very good example, so we talk about emerging markets. So we do have 2 renewables platform in India itself. So some of you may be familiar with it. So what we do is that, in fact, one of them I think is quite an interesting transition story. Both are doing solar. But beyond solar, one of them, Aprava Energy, have actually moved beyond solar and exploring other alternatives, such as, for example, we just won mandates for smart metering in India, because that is India's step towards a more efficient electricity output, measurement, etc., because all of these are necessary infrastructure as well. So that's one example. We've also invested in an offshore wind farm that's greenfield, and that's a partnership with Ørsted. So we invested in the offshore wind farm in Taiwan, actually, and glad to say that it has reached output, and we're happy with the quality. Yeah.
Great. Speaking of renewable energy, Citicorp, of course, Oliver is one of the biggest renewable project developers in the Philippines. You recently had an $86 million IPO. Can you talk to us about interest from foreign investors in the IPO, in Citicorp in general?
Yeah, so last month we did the initial public offering of the Citicorp Renewable Energy. We were able to attract Mobilis. Mobilis is a British infrastructure fund. This was their first equity investment in the Philippines. So the fund looks at green transition projects. And actually before that, 2 years ago, we listed our first renewable energy REIT company in the Philippine Stock Exchange as well. We did attract some foreign investors, ESG fund, to invest in that space as well. So we've seen, especially our government, lifted the foreign restriction last year or 2 years ago. So foreign can already own 100% of renewable energy projects. We've seen foreign investors started to take interest in the Philippines. I think if you look at the ASEAN region, Philippines is a bright spot for even your Bloomberg climate scope has rated Philippines as probably top 5 investable or clean energy investment in the region.
I mean, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has estimated that there's about a $4 trillion annual funding gap for emerging markets to be able to meet the UN SDGs, which is why I'm also asking about foreign investor interest, because a lot of that should be stopgapped, hopefully, by the developed markets. You recently had a deal with Pentagreen Capital as well. I'm wondering, as an emerging market company, when you're approaching investors, how are you what are the sweeteners, or how are you getting them to invest in emerging market projects? What are the deal structures looking like that would be different to other companies?
Yeah, good that you mentioned Pentagreen. That structure is very innovative in the sense that typically local banks can fund between 50 to 70%. That would be the leverage ratio for a renewable energy project. We were able to structure with Pentagreen such that they are able to bump up the leverage ratio to 80 or 85% via a mezzanine loan facility at the middle holding company level. I think they take comfort in the sense that we have track record. We were able to build 5 greenfield projects already for the past 8 years. if you look at the Philippines, I think from a macro picture, our government has several good policy to promote renewable energy, and we have abundant land and obviously sunlight and wind. So all you need is to address the execution risk. So this is where we believe that we're able to sell to them that we have track record. We know how to develop greenfield, how to navigate through the different challenges of early stage development and also completion risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Philippines has been very ambitious. I think your president said that there's nearly 500,000 megawatts of power potential from sources like solar, wind, hydro and geothermal in the country. But only 3% of this pipeline is currently under development. I don't know, either Oliver or Jaime, would you like to weigh in on what are the challenges of implementation in the Philippines at this stage? What are the key hurdles?
Go for it. Yeah. Well, the reality on the ground, Philippines being an emerging market, obviously, you will have to deal first from land acquisition challenges. We basically set up solar plant facilities in the rural areas where there are areas where land registration system is quite challenging. You need local knowledge to navigate, and also securing national and local government permits. To my last count, you require 200 signatures in order to build one solar project.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think, but I think our government is doing something about it. In fact, the Department of Energy has launched one-stop electronic, the EVO system. Basically, this is to shorten to shorten all the project permits required to build a plant. And lastly, I think because we need to, as you mentioned, we are aiming to increase the renewable energy mix from 20% to 50%. That would require heavy financing. Okay. While local banks have liquidity, we have yet to see foreign banks and even blended financing to really come into the Philippines and partner with local developers to really accelerate the rolling out of these solar and wind projects.
I think what I would just sort of add to that is just, I mean, the scale of this is huge. I think one of the other stumbling blocks has been access to sort of transmission sort of line, a problem that we hear a lot with renewables. But it is happening. As Oliver correctly mentioned, this administration has done an incredible job of just trying to streamline this process in order to ensure that we really are building a lot more solar and wind. And the Department of Energy has very, very aggressive targets, as you kind of mentioned. But they've been very, very supportive in ensuring that there is policy there to support it as well. So it's taking time, but I think the progress has been really fantastic.
Okay. Ujjwal, let's talk about Bhutan now. You run the Sovereign Wealth Fund, essentially, of the country. What are you doing here in Singapore? Who are you meeting, and what's kind of the pitch for Bhutan right now?
Right. Thank you. Druk Holding and Investments is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Bhutan. It's the investment arm of the Royal Government of Bhutan. And Bhutan is one of the few carbon negative countries in the world. And we have, by constitution, require 60% of our country to remain forested. Today we are about 70% forest cover. So leveraging natural resource for growing our economy is one of our major agenda as we go. So DHI, very similar to Temasek structured. We have 26 different portfolio companies. We operate in the space of energy. We are 100% hydro today. We have 2.5 gigawatt of hydro, but the interesting part is we have about 33 gigawatt of hydro potential in Bhutan, and that's one of the reasons I'm around here, looking for strategic partners, looking for sustainable investments in hydro. We had a wonderful discussion in the morning about blended financing, and if you look at some of the financing structures when you're trying to look at, for example, hydro investments in Bhutan, which has long gestation period, blended finance could come in very interestingly in terms of lowering the risk of the gestation period, lowering the expectation of the equity returns that the investors look at during the gestation period. So those are some innovative financing structures we can look at. But having said that, beyond hydro, we are looking to invest with strategic investors globally in terms of green data centers. We can green the data center, one of the conversations that is happening in the morning here at Bloomberg. was also on greening the data centers. We have 33 gigawatt of energy potential in Bhutan. We can build industries, fast computing centers in Bhutan, and also invest in hydro. So that's another area to look at. Of course, beyond that, we're looking at solar, which is an obvious choice, but also exploring geothermal in Bhutan. We want to ensure that we are 100% green in our energy portfolio as we invite investors to invest in the industry to consume in Bhutan, as well as invest in the hydro sector.
You mentioned your carbon negative and a bunch of renewable energy ideas that you have in the pipeline. Where do renewable energy exports fit in to Bhutan's GDP? How much do you see them contributing to the overall economy?
Right. So Bhutan's GDP is about 2.6 billion US at this point, about 3,000 per capita. We're just 700,000 people. Hydro contributes today with about 2.5 gigawatt. It contributes about 15% of the GDP. And we export about 50% of our hydro to India and consume about 50% within Bhutan. But then the potential is much higher in terms of developing green energy and developing industry to consume the green energy and greening, for example, the data center to look at. Yes.
Okay. I want to come to transition finance because we've been discussing this quite a bit today. I can start with ASEAN. Jaime. So you're working on a pilot project with the Monetary Authority of Singapore and the Rockefeller Foundation on this newfangled idea of transition credits, on being able to, ensure the early retirement of coal plants that are very young in Asia. Can you walk us through the progress so far on that front and what kind of pricing you're looking at for the transition credits?
So maybe just to take a little bit of a step back. So I sit at Ayala Corp sort of level. Ayala is a diversified conglomerate based in the Philippines with business interests in the finance, telco, and real estate and renewable energy development space. On the renewable energy side, there's a company called ASEAN, which has about 5 gigawatts of attributable capacity. Almost 100% of that is today renewables, with half of it in the Philippines, the other half in the region. It started about 15 years ago from a complete standing start, no megawatts to ASEAN's name. Started with an aspiration for just renewables, but along the way also invested in some coal assets. And about 7 years ago, we made the decision to completely sell down those coal assets and focus exclusively on renewables. There was one asset that remained, which is about a 230 megawatt coal asset in southern Batangas called Esseltec. And we didn't find sort of any potential sort of buyers for it, and so then started to look at other ways that we could potentially retire the plant early. So a couple of years ago, we closed the first market ETM, or Energy Transition Mechanism, which ultimately brought down the operating life of the coal asset from about 2055 to 2040. That was sort of done and dusted. Now what we're trying to see is if Esseltec could be a pilot to transition for the transition credit sort of mechanism. So as you mentioned, we're working with the Monetary Authority of Singapore to see if we could take that operating life, which right now ends in 2040, and potentially use transition credits to bring it up to sort of 2030. So could you use transition credits to potentially bridge that gap? As far as pricing, very, very early days at this point. When we look at the carbon tax here in Singapore, the range by 2030 is anywhere from sort of $40 to $60. And that's the kind of range that we're looking at, which would make the early retirement of that asset feasible. There are a number of ways that the proceeds would be used in order to offset some of the revenue that you're obviously giving up. There is still a technological gap. When you're taking that much coal off the grid, you're going to need to replace that with full renewables, and so there is a big battery component of it, so that funds it. And then the other part is ultimately the actual decommissioning of the plant and ensuring a just transition for a lot of the workers who were working in a coal plant, and now we need to ensure that there is a just transition for them. So that's ultimately what we're working on for the transition credit piece, and it's an exciting piece, but we'll see how that develops.
So are you getting bank or investor interest for taking on these transition credits?
I mean, it's really early days at this point. Most people are still sort of asking, what is a transition credit and how does it work? But I think, especially in Singapore, we've really been very pleasantly surprised at the interest. The methodology for transition credits still doesn't even exist. It's in the process of being sort of worked out. But we are getting some potential interested sort of investors in this, asking more questions, trying to sort of find out, which at this point I think is really all we could ask for. And yeah, some really fantastic potential partners in Singapore who are ultimately just hungry for more information, which I think is good at this point. Yeah.
Ujjwal, Weiling, can you talk to us about where you see transition finance in your portfolios? Do you see it as a growing slice, and where would you look at deploying money?
Especially,
Go ahead.
After you.
Okay. So CDPQ itself, so we are a Canadian pension fund manager. And we have got an AUM of about, Canadian dollars 420 billion. Right, 430 billion actually. But we have set aside about 10 billion US as a separate wallet for transition finance. We have deployed about 5 billion to date in various locations. So that is the one thing. The second thing, which we have just announced about 2 days ago, it's a proof of concept. So the ILN network, together with the members, including CPQ, including our Canadian counterpart, OMAS, for example, we have jointly committed to 400 million worth of transition debt financing for emerging markets, specifically for emerging markets. But I must say that this is still subject to internal approvals. So this is more, what I would call an intention, but it's a strong intention on the part of the IRN and its members. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is also involved in this initiative. So it's 400 million, fairly modest as a start. But as I said, this would be an interesting proof of concept. And if it works, then obviously, you can actually magnify it and multiply it. Yeah. So there are various initiatives that we're looking at.
We're looking at how, as you mentioned, how this evolves and how we'll be able to leverage. I mean, one of the things from the technical side of the power system, when we require base load, I think that's what is important to look at. And when the energy transition happens, or if you're looking for some of these markets to evolve, if you look at the grid of South Asia, it's one of the least connected grid. But for Bhutan, it's highly interconnected with the Indian grid. So that, and then because of the way the power transmits, there may be potential to look at transition financing because we are an interconnected grid for transitioning from one source to another, or looking at transition finance to see how the credit grows eventually. But those will be some of the things that we are looking at closely to be more innovative in terms of project financing eventually.
Okay. I think we can go to audience questions now. Abby, what do you have for us?
We do have a question for you, and it's a very good one.
Okay.
How are you preparing your emerging market investments ahead of a possible Trump presidency?
That should have been my first question. What was I thinking? Who would like to take that first? Weiling, can I come to you?
Well, we are naturally aligned with the U.S., being Canadian. So I would say that, we are politically neutral. Yeah, so, whether it is Trump or not, again, I think the Canadians felt as strongly behind the Indo-Pacific strategy. And I think Trump or no Trump, the fact is that the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, remains. So really, if you look at Indo-Pacific, where are the focus? That's quite clear. So, in terms of the emerging markets in Asia, it's definitely one of the recipients of the Indo-Pacific strategy. So I wouldn't say, that's going to be derailed.
If I may add, for Philippine context, the energy transition actually arises due to necessity. Because we are a country, we are a net importer of coal and gas. We're 62% of the demand are still sourced from coal. So it's really not about whether Trump or not. We see that this energy transition continue to go on. This will probably take decades for even combined effort of all the local players in the Philippines. It's a huge task, actually.
Mm-hmm. If I may add something, I think the area of transition finance in this part of the world, what is very interesting is that you see a fair number of local government, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, who is trying to create, or Pentagreen for that matter, who are trying to plant seeds, as proof of concept. Again, these are all very small, but they're proof of concept, and to see whether it can be replicated throughout the rest of Asia Pacific. Yeah. So again, and I said, this is very in line with the CDPQ belief that private sector, private investor like ourselves, institutional investors, we play a very big role. It's just that at this point in time, for us to take all of that risk is something that is probably very challenging. So we need everybody to come in, including the government. The regulators, ourselves as private institutional investors, and potentially the multilaterals coming in, philanthropy, because really what do you need for transition? You need quite a fair, you need a couple of things. You need first losses, you need your foreign exchange, because these are very long term. And you also probably need a fair bit of project preparation, because not everybody is an Ayala. So Ayala, I'm sure, has got enough resources internally for project preparation. But for a lot of the smaller players in Asia, I'm quite sure that we could do with quite a fair bit of help in project preparation, such that it becomes more bankable. So I think all of that is, Trump or no Trump, is something that my sense is that being based here in Asia is something that it's really a question of need, that we just need to find solutions.
Oh, yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
But when we talk about solutions, I'm thinking of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, right? In Indonesia, for example, that 20 billion in financing, there are questions around how that money, where that money is coming in from, is it coming in at all? So that hasn't kind of worked out the way everyone would have liked to. And Vietnam is another country looking at JETP right now. Jaime, I know that Ayala is looking at, ASIN's looking at Vietnam, but renewable projects in particular there. I wonder if you can talk to us about how you're navigating the landscape, whether you're involved with the JETP at all there, and
Sure.
What are you finding?
Yeah, so just to provide some context, so we've been in Vietnam for a number of years. We have about 1 gigawatt's worth of attributable capacity there, mainly solar and wind. I think the JETP initiative, we've heard, I think, time and time again today of just the sheer amount of capital that's going to be required for this transition. And so any of these initiatives, I think, are very, very positive developments. I think ultimately a lot will just come down to how this needs to be put in place. At this point, the JETP initiative, I think, is still very much at a G2G, a sort of government sort of level. We are, of course, monitoring it closely to see how it could sort of impact us, but no direct implications for our sort of Vietnamese strategy at this point. Really just focusing on sort of PDP8 and how we can continue to increase our investments in Vietnam, specifically in the sort of wind and solar side. But I think all very, very, very positive developments. I think we just need to be a little patient to sort of see exactly how that's going to trickle down.
When you're talking about financing in this region, political will is a big question mark, because you also have strong fossil fuel lobbies. Are you seeing any change in tone from the lobbies, from the leadership, in terms of how willing they are to transition the economies and energy sources?
Well, I think perhaps for the emerging market side of it, if that's what you're referring to, we probably have a little bit more, we've done probably a little bit more work on the developed market side within APEC itself. So that's an honest answer. So, we have looked at a couple of things in Australia. We have looked at a couple of things in Japan, as an example, more on the developed market side. And for political will, I don't think we're in a position to comment on that, because I think ultimately all government, will have to answer to its people. And ultimately, I think there will have to be, because again, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about the cost of living, you're talking about all of these together with whether you actually have got the fiscal ability to take some of these hits, and that's the reality on the ground. So that's why I kind of like the idea of having proof of concepts, rather than a very big bang approach. Because once you're able to have a proof of concept, then the different parts of the market, because it's a market, the market will come together and say that, aha, this is something that potentially we can replicate. And we can actually make money out of it. So maybe you'll try to replicate it. It's exactly the same as building solar farms from scratch. You build the first one, it's very tough. You build the second one, and then by the time you build your fourth and fifth, the market kind of have a bit of understanding. All right, this is potentially how I can look at it. How can I cut and dice it a little bit? So for me, I think the first step, or baby steps, are kind of very important in this part of the world.
Okay, thank you. Would any of you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I think very similar thoughts as we look to invest for the region, in the country. I think what's important is the demand and supply, and what is required, and what's the intent. At the end of the day, to be more sustainable investments, whether it's in the energy transition or any of the industries you want to grow for growing your jobs, or whatever is required in the region. So our focus would be on to look at the markets and to look at the demand and supply, and to see what's required by the consumers, and then navigate as we move on in the space of investments. Yes.
Okay. I'm mindful of time, so let's end on a positive note. You have 20 seconds each to identify the biggest opportunity in terms of investments or business in emerging markets for your companies right now. Ujjwal, maybe we begin with you.
Well, I have to say that it has to be energy. I think that's the space where we look at very, very positively, and we also feel that we contribute larger to humanity as such by building more green energy projects in the future. So we look forward to collaborating, networking to look at energy investments.
I think for us, emerging market, it's really the play on macro, the demographics, that it's really in the favor of emerging markets. So because we're already very, very skewed towards developed markets, and it's the macro in the emerging markets that's highly attractive.
Yeah, speaking of macro, Philippines, actually, if you compare in the region, we're early in terms of liberalizing its energy market, and that is foundational compared to the other markets where the grid and the utilities are still state-owned, which are becoming an obstacle for that energy transition.
Transition credits, and I think the other big one is on-demand renewables. I think a really, really interesting development sort of there, which is definitely a space that we are very excited about and keeping a close eye on.
Okay, great. Time's up. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found the session useful. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Dipali Goenka, CEO and Managing Director of Wellspun Living, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Avril Hong. Welcome to the stage, Dipali. Great to have you with us. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Very excited to speak to somebody who leads a company that is one of the major home textile makers with a global distribution network, and among global sustainability indices, among the top ranked textile names. So obviously there's a lot to talk about when it comes to sustainability in operations, but I wanted to start with what was really interesting to me when I looked at the business. Zero fresh water is being used, and this is an industry that is notorious when it comes to water intensity. How did that even come about?
So let me tell you a story first, Avril. You know, the story and the place that you're talking about is Anjar. It's an arid part of India, on the west part of the country. And it got devastated by a massive earthquake, you know, and in 2001. And that's where, post that, we set up this plant. We guzzle, by the way, 30 million liters of water every day. And can you imagine if there's no water, and as a textile company, we are guzzling that much of water or using that much of water, and there's no water for the communities or the farmers. So hence, this was a project that we took because we believe that, you know, we are the agents of change. We need to make that impact. And hence, we started, we give royalty to the communities. We take the sewage water, we recycle it and use it in our operations. So the farmers get their water for irrigation and the communities get potable water to drink.
Do you see this being emulated by other manufacturers? What do you think is stopping them from doing that?
You know, I think it is the size, maybe, at the moment. But I think this, and I always say, and let me tell you, to everybody here, sustainability is doing business sustainably. Because there's a lot of apprehension, Avril, that, when you invest in sustainability, it's going to be expensive. The overhead costs are too much. So I think there's going to be a water tax that goes on, year on year. This is an opportunity for people to look at it. We invest in projects. This is a project for the next 3 years and for the lifetime, for the planet, for you, and for the future generation as well.
And you say that your water system makes business sense as well, right? It kind of pays for itself now.
Absolutely, it does, totally.
Let's talk about what you're seeing in some of the other aspects of the business, because you have green energy, I think, accounting for about 30%.
Yeah.
You have a goal for 100% by 2030. That's pretty ambitious. How are you going to ramp things up and get there?
So, first of all, I must tell you, Avril, these things are done in the terms of a strategy. For an organization which is in textiles, we one day actually chalked out a complete roadmap of sustainability, and every year and every quarter we report back how much water we are consuming, how much energy are we consuming. So, there's a complete milestone to whatever we do. So by 2030, we'll be zero carbon. We're targeting to be zero landfill. The social impact that we are looking at, working with our farmers, the communities. So, everything has a roadmap, and freshwater positive. So, I just want to say that without a roadmap, without a strategy, nothing is possible.
Now it's coming from solar, biofuel.
Yeah.
What is that roadmap looking like when we hit 2030?
So, so when we talk about green energy, this was something when we took up, it is an investment upfront, right? But when you talk about the coal and the energy basket, let me tell you, 2 years back, everything went for a toss. So when we talk about coal, is it sustainable? No, it isn't. When we talk about green, can you imagine our costs will go down by 30 to 40%? It's a big deal, right? So for us to have green energy that's going to be sustainable, and it's also going to be cost competitive, I think that's what we're looking at.
Especially given how you're operating in a country that is still a net importer of energy.
But I can tell you one thing, Avril, but I think when you talk about net import of energy in the terms of, but I think for India has a very big opportunity in the terms of green, and I think it's been a very integral participant in changing and becoming and adapting green energy very, very fast as well.
That's very encouraging to see. Some of the other trends that we're seeing also is AI, and you're incorporating that into sustainable cotton farming. How exactly does that help farmers?
So when we talk about AI, I think AI is about, and AI, for us, for farmers, when we talk about India, small farms, farmers are not educated. So we took on this project with 26,500 farmers, and we are growing cotton. We're helping them and enabling them to, grow cotton, the Better Cotton initiatives that we do, or organic cotton. We have tied up with a startup for AI. With that, they can see what quality of soil it is, what is the kind of seed that, they're going to get for the next year, or, if there's going to be a pink bollworm infestation in the crop. So there's an opportunity for them, and AI enables them, the weather, the climate, because the farmers, their livelihoods depend on it. And India is an agricultural country. Now, when you talk about the AI, let me also tell you, we employ around 20,000 people in our factories, right? When we do our towel counting, and you can imagine, every day we are producing more than 150 tons of towels, right? And a person is counting that towel, right? Now AI enables you and enables him to see that, there's no fault in that cotton, in that towel. And that is where, we're looking at AI as an enabler in our complete operations as well. Industry 4.2 is also a very important part of what we do, April, here, because measuring how much energy we are using in every day, how much water we are consuming every day, is also measured. So I think this is a new way of doing things now.
That's part of your Scope 1 and Scope 2 in measuring things, right? But what about Scope 3? How are you encouraging compliance, traceability?
Scope 3 is something, and I think the audience here will agree, it's a very, very important task for the completion of sustainability. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are very easy. But when we talk about Scope 3, it needs your vendors, it needs your partners, whom you work with, right? So here, we actually are working with, when we work with the farmers, we are completely looking at the blockchain from the farmers, the field, to our factory. And then even putting in a QR code that can trace it back to the bale of cotton, where we can have, the whole traceability. But also now with the blockchain, about who are the manufacturers, what are the quality reports of that product, everything gets fed in. And now with the, with the whole Scope 3 coming into, we have already enlisted around more than 40 to 50 vendor partners of ours, where net zero goals, carbon zero goals, net water, positive, and governance in the terms of child labor and the others are also included in that. So they are enlisted on that. So let me also tell you, Avril, very close to our factory, we have our ancillary vendors who work with us. Our carton manufacturers are 85% recycled. Our packaging is just in time, so we are saving our carbon footprints as well. So it's the entire ecosystem that you're building as well.
Speaking of that ecosystem, you've shared some of the challenges when it comes to workforce participation, gender parity, whether it's blue or white collar. What are you seeing as, that roadmap there as well?
We've been talking about diversity here. We've been talking about, more women coming into diversity. But I can say something that, diversity needs an ecosystem. Diversity needs that support. So when I started working in Welspun Living Limited, which was Welspun India earlier, I had 7% women in the workforce. And today I have 30%. In the blue collar, and I'm talking about 20,000 people that work with us, right? So how did this happen? I think it just doesn't happen like that. I think we need examples. So let me give you a very heartening example of Avni Bhadra, who actually got enrolled in one of our biggest retailer partners program of VFinance. It's Walmart. She got chosen out of 2,000 factories across the globe, and she traveled from Anjar to Arkansas. And that was an aspiration, and she became inspirational and inspired so many girls. And they all, so many girls came to participate. Now, in India, a lot of time we don't have the third shift. we run all the 3 shifts. We took the permission from the government, but also took the security of the women very seriously. We have the girls' hostels next doors. So targeting to 50% women, I think the important aspect is the nurturing bit as well. So when you have a hostel, they come in from the hinterland. They are anorexic. They are not mentally there. They need a lot of support. So having a psychiatrist, you have a counselor guiding them, and having an opportunity path laid out for them. What do you want to be? Talking to them. Because imagine, because I told you, Avril, you know, blue collar is easier, but white collar is the challenge that we have. How can you have a career plan for them? So, you know, now a lot of girls, I mean, in fact, this year, 50 girls graduated. And now they graduated virtually. And now they are part of a plan for a white collar roadmap and succession as well. So, you know, this is very, very important. And when you talk about white collar and leadership and diversity, I think you need peers supporting them. You need allies who are working with them. So we have an allyship program that we do, where, you know, we have a program which has a We Listen, where we listen, which can make decisions, you know, which are unbiased, and they become advocates of women in the terms of the leadership plan. I think those are the things, you know, Avril, that we are actually doing about the white collar as well. And blue collar is something, as I spoke about. So everything needs everything. It needs nurturing. It needs a roadmap. It needs women supporting women. We have a Women of Wellspun who support them. We have an allyship program who are the peers. And even on the shop floor, how is the supervisor behaving with the woman as well, you know?
There are many pieces to this puzzle, part of the ecosystem. But what do you as a business leader want to see from government in terms of support? I mean, we look at maternity leave, for example. There are gaps there.
So I'll just say a few things. And I think this time, during the budget, Avril, a lot of things the government did in the terms of supporting manufacturing. Let me say, India is at the sweet spot. It is at the inflection point where it is becoming a very important and integral supply chain destination for a lot of retailers and a lot of global partners that you see. So skilling is becoming, and skilling is something that the government is subsidizing on. They're helping the manufacturers look at that, you know, if they're first-time job seekers, you know, how can the manufacturing get a support in the terms of the skilling benefit of at least 6 months, right? Infrastructure, you're building housing, or you're building, you know, dormitories, or, you know, hostels. How can you get subsidies as well? So this is a very important aspect. There are a lot of training programs that the government also does. Where, again, there's an opportunity for the manufacturers to get an opportunity to take these subsidies and, you know, encourage more and more people to come to fold as well.
Speaking of governments, we're also looking ahead to the US election, as our previous panel has been discussing. It's still too early to tell if there's going to be any material impact on ESG regulation, but how are you viewing this?
You know, let me tell you, I think sustainability goals for Wellspun are intact. I mean, and I mean, let me tell you one thing, and I think we are sitting in a sustainability summit here. We're talking about the planet Earth, aren't we? And I think if we all have to play a role here, and we have to be responsible, and I think that's what Wellspun Living takes their role very, very seriously. So I think for us, our roles are intact, irrespective of who comes on board. For us, it is very important to work towards creating that kind of a green ecosystem and leave this planet sustainable for the next generation. And I mean, look at the consumers, look at the food, the eating habits have changed, the way they want to look at slow fashion, everything is changing. So we are on track, and I think so is the consumer too.
The sustainability push of the business, you're saying it's going to be intact regardless of the politics of the day. Share with us a bit more about your journey as well to the boardroom. I mean, you jumped into the workforce at the age of 30, and then, you know, look where you are now. Tell us more.
So let me share my story here. I was a homemaker till my girls were 10 and 7. I have 2 daughters. And for me, when I started working, and the reason for me also to work was about my girls. I wanted to set an example for them. And that's where, because I come in from a conservative community as well. And for me to open that door for my daughters was very, very important. And as a human being, I always believe that we have to constantly evolve. And actually, that's what is very, very important. I think every day you learn a new thing. You learn it from your colleague. You learn it from your, people around you. And I think that's what it was. So when I was 10, when my girls were 10 and 7, I was 30 is the time I started. I launched my brand Spaces in India in 2003. I had my chain of retail stores. I had 200 retail stores, which I had to shut down, by the way. It was very painful. And 2010, I came on board of Welspun Living Limited, which was Welspun India at that time. Lot of judgment in the terms of whether, I was capable enough to take that role. I've learned one thing, April, and that is that, I was learning how to buy cotton, how to do the spinning or the processing. That is something you got to learn. But the important thing, April, is to play on your strengths. I knew what my strengths were. And that's where I started my journey. And never give up. There'll be a lot of times when you feel that, it's not looking good. But I think, and that's the time you have to even push further to make that happen.
Push through. I can relate to that imposter syndrome. Dipali, that's all the time we have for now, but really great to hear you sharing not just your own journey, but also the sustainability plans for the business. Dipali Goenka, CEO and Managing Director at Welspun Living, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, April.
Thank you so much. That wraps us up for today at the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit Singapore. Hope you enjoyed today's conversations as much as I did. Thank you to our speakers and moderators for providing their insights. And thank you to our summit advisors, Bangkok Bank, Fraser's Property, Red Sea Global, RGE, Schneider Electric, and Star Energy Geothermal, as well as our presenting sponsors, the Singapore Economic Development Board and Standard Chartered, for making today possible. If you would like more information on any of our advisors or presenting sponsors, please visit the Resources tab on the Summit website. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for being such a wonderful audience today. If you would like to watch any of this program on demand, you can head right over to the Summit website. Our next event in this region is the Bloomberg CEO Forum, which will be taking place in Jakarta on the 4th of September. If you would like more information on this program, please head over to bloomberglive.com/calendar for registration and additional program details. We hope to see you there. And while our main stage is concluded, we are not done yet for the night. We have a couple of things happening right now. If you are registered for our Sustainability Leadership Workshop, I will be leading that. It will be just down that way, so hope to see some of you there. We invite you all to join us in the foyer for a networking reception right now. And for those of you who are registered for our closing dinner on the green transition in Asia, we will see you in just a little bit. Thank you, everyone.